I want to start with my own personal connection to this, which is not as direct as Doug's. But it turns out that in the summer of 1971, I was still on active duty in the Army, and I was stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. I'd been back from Vietnam for 4 months at the time this happened. And those of you that know geography over there know that Fort Meade's halfway between Baltimore and Washington, so it's in the Washington media market. And in fact, there was a Washington Post news box, one of those green news boxes, near the Bachelor Officer Quarter of the state. So every day I could put in a quarter or whatever it was and keep up with what was going on. So it was very immediate for me. I thought in terms of context, one thing I'd like to point out, that by June of 1971, the United States had been involved in Vietnam militarily for 21 years. A lot of people don't realize that. It started in June of 1950 with a rush of American aid and advisors to the French, who were then fighting the Viet Minh. U.S. ground troops had been involved in Vietnam by the summer of 1971 for 6 years. 50,000, more than 50,000 of them had already given their lives. President Nixon was in the middle of his 3rd year since his inauguration, where he promised the country an honorable end to the war. But in fact, that summer, the war appeared to be stalemated both on the ground and at the peace talks in Paris. And in fact, the public disapproval of the war was increasing, including public disapproval for the first time that spring of the president's conduct of the policy of the war. So there was a lot of pressure to get the war over with, but it was stubborn, as wars are. They're easy to start, they're hard to get out of. So this is part of the context. Now, what I'm going to do next is ask how many of you have seen the movie The Post? Wow. That's what we thought. It's most of you. So I won't go. Those of you that saw it, Doug and I feel it's a pretty accurate recollection of what goes on. And despite whining from the New York Times, we thought they did a fairly reasonable job of giving the New York Times credit. For the rest of you, I don't want to bore everybody, so I'll just mention that, and Doug will go into this in more detail. This involves the leak of a classified report that was commissioned by the Johnson administration, and that's it right there, the so-called Pentagon Papers. Yeah, it was classified as top secret. It was leaked by a civilian employee named Daniel Ellsberg, although other people helped him, originally to the New York Times and the Washington Post and other papers, and then there was an important role fulfilled by Senator Gravel that Doug will talk about. And it was a huge controversy at the time. The Nixon administration tried to block it, although it didn't directly deal with anything the Nixon administration had done. It was all stuff that occurred before Nixon was inaugurated. It was a major, as he saw it, a test of principle. There were 2 major court decisions that came out of it that we might talk about later. And it set a precedent in some ways for leaks of classified information that we will also explore. So what will happen next is I will introduce our main speaker. Doug is the Harold and Audrey Anderson Emeritus Professor here at the John Glenn College. He's a New Hampshire native. You'll hear just a touch. He found his way to OSU, where he received a PhD in economics. And he had, after that, a fascinating, diverse career that included, I think his first assignment was a professor of economics at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, and at the time, he was a captain, ranked a captain in the United States Air Force. He also served as, I like this one, Doug, professor or chief economist for the President's Commission on the Development of Alaska. That must be the pipeline work you did.
No, it was post the earthquake, how to rebuild after the earthquake.
You didn't build the bridge to nowhere, though, did you? He's also special assistant to the Secretary of Commerce, the assistant chief of the Economics Division of the Congressional Research Bureau of the Library of Congress. And then he came to OSU in 1988. I've known Doug since then. He was the founding director of the National Regulatory Research Institute, held that position for 20 years. The most important, even though this by itself is a distinguished career, where Doug was at the point of history, at the point of the spear, if you will, was when he served as a legislative aide to Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska. At the time, Senator Gravel read the Pentagon Papers, and we'll talk about this, into the congressional record. And Doug and the others who participated in this did this at the great risk to themselves, because it was not clear at the time how this all was going to turn out. So let me turn it over to Doug, and let's give him a Buckeye welcome to get him started.
Well, thank you, Bill, and appreciate that generous introduction. And the only thing I mentioned is I actually, because I'm so pleased with this, came here in 1978.
Oh, 70.
Around 88, so 10 more years. Now, it's clear that the Post movie has generated a cottage industry almost, and things having to do with leaks and even more specifically the era of the Pentagon Papers. So I suppose my remarks to you are a little bit in the cottage industry tradition. Now, I'm also aware that any storytelling of the "I was there" variety is dangerous. It's worried about in terms of how good a research method it is for storytelling. On the other hand, Professor Desai, a colleague of ours here in the college, who's a very good methodologist, always remarks that on the ladder of research methodology, the storytelling is legitimate. It's okay. It's one that we can use. I've always thought that the worry was not as great. Is too great about that. In that, on the one hand, the tendency to embellish is probably netted out with the forgetfulness of facts along the way. and so I think I consider it a wash on that score. But you can use any discount factor you want on that. In any event, it is an I was there story. But those are some of the limitations. Let me say a sentence or two, though, about the papers before telling this I was there story. In addition to Bill's remarks, there are about 3,900 pages to it, and here I brought as our only prop the 4-volume Pentagon Papers. I don't defend this much, but I noticed that when I brought it to Page Hall the last couple of days, those 4 volumes, I was very possessive about them. I mean, I put them in the cabinet there, and I said, I'm going to leave them here overnight. So I was kind of almost thinking back to the days when, in June of '71, when we had them for the first time fishing them out from under Senator Gravel's bed, where he had stored them. So let me say, about 3,900 pages. It was commissioned by Secretary McNamara in 1969, and it was to be, as he called it in his commissioning of their study, encyclopedic and objective. And he told the group that he wanted to have 6 top-notch researchers do it, and they had 3 months to do it. In fact, it took 2 years, and there were 37 researchers in doing the Pentagon Papers, one of whom, of course, was Daniel Ellsberg. The group had access to all documents of every agency in government, as arranged by, of course, Secretary McNamara, to get a full and thorough review of the files and documents, except White House files. They were not fair game. Nor were any personal interviews with White House principals. That was the only out-of-bounds thing for the Pentagon Papers. So when the study was transmitted to the Secretary, it was transmitted in June of '69. There's a sentence in it that said, "The result of all this study, Mr. Secretary, was not so much a documentary history as a history based on documents that were checked and rechecked with ant-like diligence." Great phrase, I always thought. So you see, what you're saying is this is just document after document after document. It wasn't some presumed story that was to be told, and then you went out and found the document. So here's the story itself that I want to tell you, because it was odd. It was very peculiar. About 10 o'clock one night, I got a phone call then Washington, D.C. We lived in Northwest Washington. It was from Senator Gravel. And he said, Doug, I want you to bring a toothbrush and your pajamas and come to the House. Well, Revelle was an unusual senator, but that was that was still a strange phone call to get. And I, of course, have been to his house many times, but not with toothbrush and pajamas. So I told Darlene, my wife, Mike wants to see me, and I went off. And when I got to his door, he let me in right away and closed it right away. And he said, "I've got the Pentagon Papers." And he said, "I want your help to go through them and help me prepare for releasing them on the Senate floor tomorrow." And generously, he said, "Now, if you don't want to do this, because of course there was some substantial risk, it's okay, without prejudice, just decline, that's okay, but I would like to have it." Well, there were 3 other colleagues, staff colleagues of mine who were there, and I said, "No, Mike, count me in." I didn't think that through very much at the moment. But I said, "Count me in." It turned out that the senator, probably wrongly, were worried at the time that there were FBI and others surveilling his house, and we thought that any moment it's possible that there'd be a raid on the house and we'd be carted off along with the Pentagon Papers. I mean, those times were that, those of you who date back to it, those times were that scary in a way. Now, that never happened that night, but in any event, I said, "Fine, let's do it." So he had the papers under his bed, and we would fish out a kind of a chapter at a time, the 4 of us, and go through them. And the task was 2 things. One was to review the very quickly, of course, but not redact by felt pen, but with scissors, cutting out when names of CIA agents and spies for us, and things that were clearly dangerous to have somewhere else, and we did the best we could on that. The other role we had was to talk with him about whether he should do it or not. I mean, these are top secret documents, the Defense Department, war all these years, and we knew how explosive it would be, and also how unusual it would be to do it. So we had that discussion with the pros and cons of doing so. He, I thought, had, at least for me, the most persuasive argument, as we did the pros and cons, and he had 3. One was that as a United States Senator and in the Senate, he was in a co-equal branch of government. He was not subservient to the executive branch, and certainly not subservient to the Department of Defense, but a co-equal branch of government. And he felt that he was not unduly constrained just because, as he said, some obscure captain stamped top secret on each page. Now, it might not have been an obscure captain that made it top secret, but I remember his saying that. His second argument was that the enormity of the deceit that were contained in the papers of government against the people was so great that it had to come out. One had to go do it somehow and get it out and release. And his third argument was, since the Supreme Court had already enjoined a couple newspapers, and we're going to decide pretty soon whether prior restraint was something that is supported by the Supreme Court on the newspaper's publication, Revelle felt that if I wait till the court decides, and they decide against the newspapers, then I'll really have a harder time surfacing and releasing these documents, because not only would the whole executive branch be mad, but the legislative branch will be, and a lot of people don't like doing things against the Supreme Court. And so he said, I think we should preempt the court chance of making a bad decision. And so he said, if I go out and get this on the release on the Senate floor, at the time was his idea, then the Supreme Court's decision is essentially moot. They're out there. Now, as it happened, as you know, including in the movie, the Supreme Court did within 2 days. But a day after we came out with all of it was the timeline. They decided in favor of the press. So we hashed that around late at night, and he was still clipping things in the paper. And he said, "Look, I'm tired. You guys are tired of me. I'm going to bed," and did. Now the next day, he tried to get recognized on the Senate floor, and we had the papers there, and he was going to read them into the congressional record, which is public record, as you know, and not to be meddled with when it's spoken on the Senate floor. He kept being frustrated in getting recognized. The Republicans in the Senate knew something was afoot, I think, but they didn't know what, but they knew something was going on. Indeed it was. So they kept frustrating with parliamentary maneuver Gravel getting the floor to read these things. So late afternoon, still not having gotten the floor, the senator decided, well, this is not going to work. So he hooked up, and that is, I'm afraid, the term. He thought of it, having a committee hearing, doing it that way, getting it out into the public through a committee hearing. Well, how do you do that? Well, he was chairman of a subcommittee, an obscure subcommittee of the Public Works Committee, called the Subcommittee on Buildings and Grounds. And that's always assigned to the most junior senator, so they all have some subcommittee chair. And Senator Gravel had that. Actually, I found it, as let me say as an aside, but pretty interesting, because we did things like save Union Station, because it was going to be torn down. We did things like save the post office, that grand old building, although now it's a Trump hotel. But you know, the Buildings and Grounds did things like that. So we were, actually it was kind of a useful committee in any event. The senator said, let's do it, I'm going to convene my subcommittee. So we, the staff, were sent around the Senate office building, putting notice under the doors of his members of his subcommittee. I don't remember how many there were, maybe, let's say 8 or so. Of course, they're all gone and on home. But then we stuck them under the doors of each of these senators, giving them notice that at 10:30 that night there'd be a meeting. Then you also have to have a witness. So Senator Gravel was resourceful there. There was a representative, Bob Dow, of the state of New York. And he was on the House Committee on Buildings and Grounds, so he's kind of a counterpart committee in the House. And he was also anti-war, as Vietnam War, as was Senator Gravel. So the senator called and said, Congressman, I need you over here to testify tonight, and for a few minutes. Oh, fine, I'll be there. So he came, and Gravel opened the meeting. Of course, there was a court reporter there. And the congressman said, I would like to say that I'm having trouble getting monies for federal facilities in my district. And Senator Gravel said, that's great testimony. And you know why? Because all the money is going to the Vietnam War, and I'd like to talk about that. So, the congressman didn't know why we hooked this up, but he was so he had done his part with his one sentence that he needed money for his district. So then at that moment, Senator Gravel started reading the Pentagon Papers. And he read for, I forget now, it's 47 years ago, so don't push me too hard on that. But he read for 2 hours probably, and you can read quite a few, but you can't read 3,900 pages. But he read for probably 2 hours. And there we are at first alone in the hearing room virtually. But I got a phone call, called out of the room, and it was from Roger Mudd. It was certainly not someone that typically called me, but you may remember the name, a very famous reporter. And he said, what's going on down there? I hear Mike's doing something. And I said, oh, yes. And I said, he's reading the Pentagon Papers. And he said, I'll be right down. And then a whole bunch of people began to gather around the event. But after reading for a couple hours, Gravel was very tired. And it was so stressful. And I think it was that made him begin to tear up and kind of break down, choke up. And so he couldn't keep reading much further. And we were startled, we the staff, and didn't quite know what to do or say, but he did. And he said, I ask unanimous consent to put the remainder of my remarks in the record. Well, the remainder of my remarks were the other 3.5 volumes of them. And of course, for unanimous consent, someone has to give unanimous consent. There was only one senator in the room, Gravel, so he gave it to himself. And that was that. That was the end of the hearing. And of course, there was kind of chaos in the room at that time. But at that moment, the Pentagon Papers were public domain. Now, a bit about the timeline, so I don't want to have to claim too much here. And it was even hard to remember, and I talked to him and others before our session here over the last few weeks to make sure I had it right. The timeline about the release of papers was this. The Washington Post did decide to release, and you saw that rather dramatic moment, and they're throwing the papers out on the road, and they released their major excerpts from the Pentagon Papers. That next day is when we had our session on the Senate floor. So they did release it first, out of the excerpts. In the face of that injunction, they did it, like the movie said. But the next day is when we had our drama on the Senate floor and then in the hearing room and released the whole thing into that 1:32 in the morning where it became public. And then the next day, the Supreme Court came down with this decision in favor of the newspapers. And that was the sequence of events. So it can't be claimed that, Senator Gravel was the first out with it. But he certainly was the first with the whole batch. Senator told me to be on the Senate floor. Staff can't be on the Senate floor anymore, but in those days you could. And so I was stationed on the Senate floor, and my task that next morning, after his reading him into the record, was to call him and tell him how did the Senate react, what's going on. Well, the first rattle out of the box is Senator Saxby of Ohio. Imagine that little coincidence here. Gets up and says he wants to have Gravel censured for treasonous behavior and denounced what he had done to release top secret documents. Now the Democrats controlled the Senate at that time, but still that's a dangerous talk when someone says that. Saxby of Ohio. So I dutifully called the senator, and he wasn't thrilled to hear. The first reaction was that story, but I said I hung up. I'm back on the set. Senator Fulbright. J. William Fulbright, very distinguished senator that many of you will remember or read about, head of the Foreign Relations Committee, called me over and said, "Tell Mike I wish I'd done it." That was a good call. So when I called the Gravel, he was thrilled at that, of course. And then not long after, Senator Ed Muskie, again, a very distinguished senator, he called me over. He was from Maine and New Hampshire. Maine do well together. He called me over and said, "Jones, tell Mike that he did the right thing." So I called Gravel and said, "Muskie says you did the right thing." So there was that kind of a strange morning, and that's kind of the end of my story about that dramatic couple of days. Within a short time, of course, there was a court case. Gravel versus the United States, and important issue in the court case. One of the issues was the senator acting with senatorial immunity in doing this, and the court had to wrestle that around, and Solicitor General Griswold took the case for the federal government against Gravel. You may remember, I think it's Irvin Griswold against Gravel. Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, very distinguished Southern senator, been there forever, was kind of the scholar of the Senate, and enormous defender of the Senate as an institution, said to Gravel, "I'll defend you in the Supreme Court." Now, that was interesting because, among other things, the Senator Ervin didn't like Gravel at all. and kind of half thought it was kind of a dumb thing to have done. But he said the institution of the Senate is what he cared about. And he defended successfully Gravel, and the Supreme Court said that Senator Gravel had senatorial immunity because he was acting in his role as the United States Senator in a co-equal branch of government. Now, that was great news, but we staff wondered, does that extend to the staff? We weren't keen on going into the slammer over that night of work. And happily, the court had a little sentence that said, and the staff is acting for the senator, in the name of the senator, on Senate business. And certainly, War and Peace is Senate business. The immunity extended to the staff, so we were pretty pleased about that. I think Bill looked it up. The court decided 5-4 in favor of senatorial immunity in Gravel, and it's nice that one person saw to it that we were all immune in doing what was important Senate business. So let me stop there. There are a couple other side stories might be of interest, but before the chairman gavels me down, let me stop there.
I'm stuck. My worst nightmare was that Doug would be in the middle of this great story and I would have to cut him off, and I don't want to do that. So thank you for being both informative, entertaining, and succinct. As Trevor mentioned, the purpose of this is to be a dialogue, so obviously we have some things to say, but Doug and I, being thorough people, actually went through the sign-up list to see what kind of people were coming here. We have a wonderful, eclectic combination of views and skills and everything here. So I think we'll have a really interesting discussion. In order for our people online to be able to hear what's going on, I will repeat the questions, but we'll ask you, will there be a microphone floating around for questioners? Yeah, okay, so we'll have that. The other thing is, to re-emphasize what Trevor said, this is not Washington, D.C., this is Columbus, Ohio, so we can afford to be civil to each other, even if we disagree. And Doug and I also wanted to make sure we issue this disclaimer. We are comfortable with our respective roles, as him as a participant, me as sort of a historian. We realize there are aspects of this, particularly constitutional law, where we are not experts. Now, in the past, I've been accused by people who lack a sense of humor to have been practicing law without a license. So I'll be careful and control myself. But if we have people with legal background in here, they're welcome to participate in this if those questions come up. We will be here till 7, so we'll have plenty of time to do this. And remember, after it's over, there will be an online survey. Now, the other thing to help spark discussion, although we think a minimal spark will be needed, Doug and I came up with 4 questions that we'd like you to think about, and we'll start working through them. The first one is to look back with hindsight and ask if Ellsberg was justified in releasing the documents, was the press justified in printing them, and was Senator Gravel justified in releasing the whole report? And secondly, did this shorten the war or not? So that's the first set of questions. The second one is, there have been subsequent releases of classified information by various people. I have a whole laundry list here I won't read. But were those justified, and how does that fit in with the precedent there? So we can come back to that. Third thing deals with what Doug just talked about. In 1971, Congress and the courts and the press acted as a check on the power of the president. Are these institutions up to that task today, and should they be? And then question number 4, because this is a school of public affairs, or college of public affairs, excuse me. What are the moral obligations of a person, whether they're an employee or a contractor, to expose wrongdoing by an institution, powerful individual, or a group of individuals? And that's certainly timely today. So we'll start with the first question. Doug and I will bat that around just a little bit, and then we'll open it up to you and let you carry it from there. So, Doug, the first question is, were Daniel Ellsberg and his allies justified, and did it shorten the war?
On the second question, to shorten the war, a very important one, of course, we Senator Gravel, our activity was partly aimed to help shorten the war. There was such intense feelings already against the war that it was this release we felt would maybe push it over the cliff into, you know, not civil strife, but that it actually would cause such overwhelming pressure to end the war and stop the killing, frankly, that it could work. Now, as it played out, the numbers are something like this. We did this in June of '71. There were 2 more years before the troops were really drawn down to something like 15,000 as logistics and advisors. And then 2 more years after that before it was signed, the end of the war, North and South having surrendered. So it was 4 years after we all participated in this, so I wouldn't want to argue too strongly how much it shortened the war. Although, remember, we're having wars now of 16 years. Maybe one could assert that it would have been more than the 4 years if we hadn't done what we did. And in any event, I think it certainly heightened the intensity of the pressure to stop it. On the first part, was Ellsberg justified? I think so. I think his motivation was correct. He was a contractor. He wasn't in serving in uniform, if one makes a distinction there, because then you have guys like Chelsea, who was a soldier doing this. Chelsea Manning was a soldier doing this. Ellsberg was a contractor. I think Snowden was a contractor on his escapade, and not a soldier, military, or governmental person. So I think motivation, the motivation for it, and it wasn't a revenge or a disgruntled employee, which is sometimes why people release secret things. So motivation, if you weigh that one, I think it's clean there. On context, which is another basis on which I think one has to think about these releases, the context was, I thought, so powerful, that is the war itself, that it fits there. And then the question of the stakes, how high were the stakes? And I think the stakes here were very high. I mean, when you're talking about some of the other releases there, like I guess the Snowden one or something, I'm not sure that how important it is to learn that sure enough the United States was tapping Angela Merkel's phone. I mean, I don't, you know, that kind of, it's not a high enough stakes for me to think that that's a great idea. Spying on one's own citizenry, that might be high enough stakes to meet the stakes test. So motivation, stakes, and context are the way I'd weigh it, and I think the Ellsberg one scores well on all three.
I guess my 2 cents of that would be, I agree with Doug on the point of was it justified. The amount of government lying and cover-up was so overwhelming that deserved to come out. And remember, although the Nixon administration tried to block it, it was about stuff that had happened 40 years earlier, up to 2 years earlier, so there was no current release of information that compromised sources or agents. And in fact, we can now look back with almost 50 years of history, and the fears that somehow that report itself would cause damage to long-term American interests is not correct. What caused damage to long-term American interests was several administrations lying about what they were doing in Vietnam. So on that point, I agree with Doug. On the point about shortening the war, I don't think so. I think it was baked in by that point. By that point, American troops had been withdrawn by 300,000. There was, we know now, there was enormous pressure on the Nixon administration. In fact, they put pressure on themselves to announce a settlement before the election of 1972. In fact, so much pressure that they prematurely announced peace was at hand, if you remember that. And what finally broke the logjam was that the North Vietnamese finally gave up their position that the two government had to be removed, and the United States gave up its position that 150,000 North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam had to be removed. So fundamentally, they agreed to leave things hang out the way they did after a decent interval. So I don't think it shortened the war. I think it was well motivated. I also don't agree with the people that argue the anti-war movement lengthened the war. This was a civil war. The North Vietnamese, although they aren't necessarily democratic, benign people, were committed to unifying their country by force if necessary, and if it took 50 years if necessary. And it's unfortunate what happened, but it was going to happen. There's only so much the United States can do. So that's our thought to get this thing started. So let's start. We'll take any questions if you want to start on this first point, and then we can start talking about the others as well. So let's see who wants to be first out of the box. Looks like we got one.
Ellsberg has been on the air recently because he's written a book about the nuclear wars, of which he was an architect to write the plans. Directly related here, he had an assignment in Vietnam where he spent 2 to 3 months on the ground in Vietnam. In one incident, the reporter said, "What did the staff person pulled out a gun and shot?" You know, they were threatened, and Ellsberg had been a Marine, and something he had a gun. He got him. He wrote a report over 100 pages that we were not winning the war, and McNamara read it on the airplane on the way back. He got off the plane. In front of the camera said, "You turned the tide, we're going forward." He just flat out lied.
That's a good point. Well, it wasn't a question, it was a legitimate observation. In fact, that scene is portrayed in the movie very effectively. And again, the statement was, for those of you who didn't hear, what the movie portrayed, what this gentleman described, was that Daniel Ellsberg, in fact, was a Marine officer, and at one point he strongly supported the war. That's why, in some ways, he felt compelled to do something against it. But after that tour in Vietnam, he thought we were losing. He presented a memo to McNamara, who was defense secretary at the time, on the plane on the way back to the United States. McNamara read it and seemed to agree with him, but the minute McNamara stepped off the plane in front of the cameras, he of course took the official party line and said we're winning, and even though he, McNamara, knew he was not speaking the truth.
So, the movie, of course, is a very small slice of the whole picture that happened, a very effective one. But could you refresh our collective memories as to what eventually was the fate that Daniel Ellsberg suffered from all of this? Can you recap for us a little bit about the legal travails that he went through after this?
It's a good question. So the question is, what was the fate that Daniel Ellsberg suffered as a result of all this? Doug, do you want to?
Well, only the beginning part, and perhaps, and that is he was being hunted all around the country by the Justice Department, and even out of the country in Paris, hunting for Ellsberg. This is during these days that we were talking about. In fact, he was, of course, he's there at MIT as a researcher at the time, and he was hiding around Cambridge, so he hadn't gone very far from where everybody last seen him there at MIT. He eventually turned himself in to the government, to the federal government. As to the cases with him, I can't.
I think it's fair to say I don't think he ever suffered any legal conviction, but he suffered, I'm sure, a lot of personal harassment. Go ahead.
I just read about it today.
Okay.
I just read a brief article about that today. It was interesting, I thought, that he was being followed and investigated. They were looking for dirt, you know, on him as a disclaimer. And I don't know if the White House or the government somehow released, you know, people that were going after him called the plumbers, and we know that from Watergate. That happened right after this. And actually it was G. Gordon Liddy and Huntsman, was that his buddy?
Howard
Howard Hunt. Those two were actually looking at him, Ellsberg, trying to find something on him.
Well,
And
remember,
then the
his
scandal-
psychiatrist's offices where the
Yes.
break-in was, and it was Ellsberg's
Yeah.
psychiatrist.
But I guess after then the scandal of Watergate came out,
Right.
they said these guys have no credibility and dropped the case. The government dropped the case.
I'm sure there was a lot of stress on him and on his family
Yes.
at the time. And although he's still around, and he's a fairly high-strung individual.
Yes.
So it was he took a lot of risks in doing that. And again, although he escaped formal censure, he had to go through a lot over the next couple of years until other scandals kind of superseded that.
A couple of things. I didn't know where Senator Gravel got the papers that night. I really didn't want to know. Kind of the Nixon defense. I didn't want to know. But I subsequently found that what happened is he got them from Van Dyken at the Washington Post, who had them from Ellsberg. By then, Ellsberg and Gravel had agreed that Gravel would surface these. It turns out that, and I also didn't know this beforehand, but Ellsberg his plan was to get him out publicly through a public figure or the press. And he first started with the public figures. And he had approached the ones we know about, Fulbright. He had approached Hughes of Iowa and McGovern. And they all said no. They wouldn't play. And so he then went the press route. That was when he went with the New York Times. He wanted to go the newspaper route. But when that got enjoined, he came back to, had come back to trying to do it with a political figure, in this case, Gravel. They'd never met. They didn't know each other. Just strangely, Gravel was in the midst of filibustering the end of the draft. And Ellsberg called him and said, "Mike, I've got enough pages for you. You can filibuster forever." and Senator knew instantly that he was talking about the Pentagon Papers, and he said, "Okay." And so that night before we did all this in his house, Mike and my colleague, the administrative assistant, Joe Rothstein, I was a legislative assistant. In those days, senators had just one of each, except for Cranston of California, Javits of New York, and Kennedy of Massachusetts. Now they have fleets of legislative assistants, but at that time, we each had just one. But so my colleague, Joe Rothstein, and the senator met Van Dyken outside the Mayflower Hotel there in downtown D.C. and moved the Pentagon Papers from Van Dyken's car to Senator Gravel's trunk, and off I went to his house, and that's what. So there was some. Ellsberg was known to be the person, but couldn't be found. On the business of what happened to people, whether bad things happened, one could also, if you were very cynical about it, say, well, look what happened to the real principals, like Henry Kissinger and Robert McNamara. McNamara goes on to another distinguished career with the World Bank, and Henry goes on to be called on by the networks to come up and talk anytime there's any subject of foreign affairs, for him to give the gravelly, several octaves lower than there are octaves, response.
How old were you when all this went on?
The question is, how old was Doug when all this happened?
And the second part, did you tell your wife what all this was?
Oh, yeah. What'd you tell your wife?
Oh, I never thought of that. I certainly told her why I was away. I don't think I gave a play-by-play account. On the matter of age, it was 1971, and so I was 38, so I was not naive about government.
If you've done the math, it's impossible that someone this young could have as many years after that.
How long had you been in government service at that time?
Yes. Well, the answer to that is I've been 5 years as a professor at the Air Force Academy, and I'd been 3 years stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and I'd been probably a year loaned out to the Office of the Secretary of Defense Systems Analysis Division. So I probably had, 9 or 10 years by then.
Okay.
And I was certainly not a bomb thrower or anything. I always very much cared about authority and tended to tilt toward authority. Whether it's a coach or a manager of a baseball team, I tend to tilt toward the manager. Or a coach of a basketball team, I tilt toward the manager. So, or at the university, I tilt toward the dean.
Dean's glad to hear that.
So I'm not anti-authority. I think that's how institutions get along pretty well with authority. But of course, when you get to the extremes that we're talking about, then there's something else. Well, go ahead. Sorry.
No, thank you. And I'm glad that this other gentleman asked about your Asian experience, because it helps. One of the questions I have, given your age, your experience, the fact that you weren't naive to all of this, and you mentioned earlier your concern about whether the immunity that eventually was given to the senator also covered staff. Did you consider that night when the senator called you in, consulting legal counsel about what's going to happen to you if you stay the night and engage in this work?
No, I didn't think of that.
Yeah. So the question is for the online folks, did you consider consulting legal counsel before sticking your neck out?
That's what people do nowadays. No, I never thought of that. I must say, standing in the doorway, I didn't reflect on the whole matter much as I probably should have. But and it was somewhat unnerving of what could happen. But I think it was more that was kind of the job to do and help the senator out. No, I didn't think about that.
The other question is really the nature of the work that you did that night in censoring the documents. Where did that idea of censoring the documents come from? Where did you get guidance on what to take out and what to leave in? How were those decisions made in the absence of any authority figure?
Let me again repeat the question. So what guidance did you use in excising stuff out of the documents, and where did that guidance, if any, came from?
Yeah, I'm glad you said excising, because we didn't, censoring, I don't like that word.
I figured that's why I used it.
Because we weren't certainly trying to slant anything. And we were amateurs, just liberal arts persons when it comes to redacting. But we were just doing, and I don't remember it terribly clearly, I must say, but I do remember we did it with scissors, not felt pen. And I remember we looked for names of CIA agents that, if they were known, bad things could happen. And also spies that were doing spying for us, that if that was known, bad things would happen. It was that kind of low-level, I guess, analysis on our part of what we were doing. But there was never do I at least remember that we excised anything that had to do with a policy matter that portrayed someone in a bad light. There was plenty of those. I can't do much better with that one.
Okay. Let me start the next round of questions, and Doug and I have talked about this, so I'll throw this out and let you react to it. There were a number of subsequent releases of once classified information. For example, you had the Scooter Libby case where a CIA agent was outed, and he actually went to prison for, I think, 30 months for that. There was the Chelsea Manning, Scooter Libby was an aide to Vice President Cheney. There was the Chelsea Manning case, who Doug referred to, who was a soldier and leaked diplomatic cables and war logs, and she went to prison also in that case. Then there was the Edward Snowden, the contractor that leaked stuff to WikiLeaks over NSA and DOD documents, hundreds of thousands of those, and the feds were after him, and he got, what's the word I want to use? Asylum in the Soviet Union. And the United States government still views him as a fugitive. Now, and I want to preface all these by saying I'm not saying all these are equivalent, nor is Doug, are equivalent to the Ellsberg case. They're just cases where people, for various reasons, have leaked classified information. More recently, in a more political basis, you had Senator Dianne Feinstein releasing committee testimony that the majority of the committee did not want to release. And then you had Congressman Devin Nunes just earlier this week releasing or using a classified information in a committee staff report that has now been made public, and now the Democrats on that committee also want to make their report public, and that's being reviewed at the White House. So you have a whole range of stuff, and I think the conclusion Doug and I came to is that while we feel very strongly that what Ellsberg did under those circumstances was the right thing, we don't necessarily apply that same degree of approval to some of these other things that happen, and in some cases we think people's lives have potentially been threatened by these unauthorized leaks. So we'll let some of you, if you want to offer any thoughts on that, but it's an interesting dynamic.
One of the things that occurs to me in comparing this release to more contemporary versions is that this is an effort of many people over a period of time, 37 people over a couple of years, and it resulted in something that's effectively curated. There's some selection bias. They put things in a particular order and organize them within the framework and provide context. And I think that might be a key difference between the more contemporary examples we have, where it's an info dump. Here it is, here's lots of things that you can jump on for your purposes or try and find some pattern or analysis that benefits any particular site. That's not exactly what we had here. And I think that organizational framework and that act of selection had something to do with how it was so clear to people that this is something that needed to be in the public domain and that it was an ethical decision to do so. You could comment on that.
That's and again, let me repeat a condensed version of what you just said, which I think is right on target. That the information that Ellsberg released was a study that was done in context and gone over. It wasn't just a dump of a bunch of documents. There was a coherence to it. And it was also, again, stuff that had occurred in the past that was not contemporary. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, historian, we're all about context.
Good.
No, I think that's an excellent statement. That you're right. It would probably, although people are kind of pushing this way, probably bad to think that the process of using a committee hearing, as Senator Gravel did, to get these things out, is somehow should be a model for whenever you have that. Why don't we just go? You shouldn't casually go do stuff like that. I hope it doesn't become kind of a model. But Rachel Maddow the other day on her show talked to, in fact, interviewed Senator Gravel and talked about as well, maybe this is a good model that you invented years ago, 47 years ago. And so I think it's not a great model, but particularly it served well in that particular case. But I think your observation is exactly correct.
Let me move now to another topic, because I found out something. Whoops, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, go ahead.
This question actually could go anywhere. I was a television newsman in those days in Cleveland. And my recollection is that we would give the Pentagon Papers 60 seconds at 6 o'clock and 30 seconds at 11, then go on to the next homicide, house fire, or car wreck. In general, not just TV news, but how do you think of the news media covered that story? Dallas, etc.
So the question is, how do we think the news media covered that story? Was it balanced or was it superficial? That kind of thing.
Well, if that story, you don't mean just the Gravel release of the papers, but you meant the probably didn't devote as although that's generally the case probably, they didn't devote as much time as the story warranted. But I don't remember being hypercritical of that at the time. In the particular Gravel case, Alaskans did not like what he did. We knew the constituency was not going to be terribly supportive of what we were going to do that next day, and they weren't. Now, he was reelected for another term after that. But Alaskans are peculiar sorts, and they're pretty straight-laced about how you treat something called a top-secret document by the United States government.
Let me add something to that. I would draw a distinction between the way electronic media covered it. That was fundamentally a print story because of the complexity and that type of thing. And I think the Washington Post and the New York Times and those other papers that publish that should stand tall for what they did at that particular moment in time.
In the other papers, can I just mention that Ellsberg cast the net pretty widely because he didn't know where it could catch on. The other papers we now learn are not just the ones in the movies, but also the Los Angeles Times, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Detroit Free Press, the Christian Science Monitor were all approached by Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers. So certainly the print press had a wide chance to play, and all declined. Well, not and the Boston Globe, but the ones we always just hear about are the Times, the Post, and the Boston Globe.
So
someone was going to comment.
this is a question actually for Bill. Bill, I believe you said you were still serving in the Army at the time. So I'm curious as to when this news broke about the Pentagon Papers. I'm curious as to what your fellow servicemen and women at the time, what their reaction was.
The question is, what was the reaction of servicemen and women at the time when this occurred? Let me answer that. It's an excellent question in two parts. One is, in relationship to the Vietnam War, various sides tend to invoke, quote, the troops to support whatever it is they're trying to argue. And the troops were quite a diverse group. The country was divided, so were the troops. On my fire base, which is a small microcosm, we had some people that were openly anti-war. They thought it was a big mistake. We had other people that if the orders had been to march on Hanoi, they would have done it with glee. We had an even larger group who I would say was somewhat apolitical or apathetic about the politics of it. Now, the interesting thing is, though, that I think it's safe to say for a lot of the troops, particularly the time I served, which was later in the war, so by then everybody knew the war was winding down, they didn't want to be the last casualty, that type of thing. There was a certain amount of cynicism to begin with, and the Pentagon Papers simply confirmed what had been a whole litany of stuff. The big event that I remember in the time I was in uniform, that was like a poison through the military, was the revelation of the My Lai massacre and the subsequent cover-up. That you just could not believe American soldiers would have done that. And the evidence was, despite what some people say, the evidence was overwhelming that what happened that day, that those American soldiers, under command leadership, murdered unarmed women, children, and civilians. And people just couldn't believe that. So that kind of was in the context. Also by then you had had that the secret bombing of Cambodia had surfaced. A lot of other things, the Laos invasion, people recognized was kind of a fiasco, but the Nixon administration tried to make it look good. So it just simply added to the cynicism of the troops. A fascinating story I would tell. I was in Doug's office and he showed me an email he had received from a Vietnam veteran who I think was an airborne officer, who I would say his political views from what he said in the email were very different from mine, but yet was very cynical and as about what the, kind of agreed with what the Pentagon Papers had released. It's terrible that the government was lying about what we were doing. Those of you that saw the Ken Burns series may remember there was a wonderful interview, and I think it was a Marine veteran, that said ours was the first generation to go to war when we knew our government was lying about what we were doing. And so I think that part, regardless of the politics, is a big part of it. But again, although the Pentagon Papers was extremely controversial and a big deal, it was a big deal in some ways because it confirmed what everybody had suspected all along.
Please.
Given the way that media has evolved and everything that's happened since the time of the Pentagon Papers, do you feel like something like this could happen, or is it happening now? Or do you feel like we always get a clear picture of what's happening in Afghanistan?
That's a good question. So the question is, in today's media environment, could you see something like this happening again? Is that a fair?
Yes, sadly. The stress on the media now, the attacks on the media, they're so ugly and awful. It's extremely dangerous stuff. There were attacks on the media, of course, in the Nixon, who couldn't stand the media either. But we're really counting on the institution of the press to see us through, in my opinion. They've done it before for us. We were saved, really, in the Watergate case by the press. And we're saved, I think, by on the Vietnam matter with the press. And we need to be saved one more time, I think, by the press. I hope they're up to it, and I hope they don't yield to the stresses. And I'm generally not pessimistic about that.
Let me add what I think there's kind of a dichotomy. I think the New York Times and the Washington Post right now are standing tall and are financially stable enough that they can duke it out with the president and hold their ground. What I worry about is a lot of the other newspapers that contributed to this, the litany that you mentioned, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, have all had financial trouble of sorts. So the press is defined by, now you could have the Wall Street Journal to a press that is making an independent stand, even though their owner is someone who might be more sided with the government. So you have some big giants that are still there. The next level, though, I worry a little bit about where that leads us. The other thing that leads to, I wanted to share this fascinating factoid, because we're worried about whether the Supreme Court has become more political. So I went and looked up the 6-3 decision that supported the Washington Post and the New York Times to see who voted where. And this is fascinating. So you had 4 appointees from Democratic presidents, FDR, JFK, LBJ. All 4 of them voted in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post. You had 2 Nixon appointees. Both of them voted for the United States against the 2 papers. So the question is, who are the other 3? There were 3 justices appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president. They broke 2-1 in favor of the Washington Post and the New York Times and made it to 6-3 decision. And you ask yourself, is there a president serving today who has appointed justices who would split, whether it's 1-2, 2-1, who would not take a monolithic view? And I don't know. You have to make your own judgment.
I mentioned that there were, not to rattle on about it, but there were a couple little semi-stories about this that were subsequent ones. And that is the Beacon Press. Senator Gravel arranged for Beacon Press, a place he didn't know particularly, but a Beacon Press in Boston is run by the Unitarian Universalist Church Foundation, and it's a non-profit one. And Gravel wanted to get the papers in one place out in a formal book form like this, and did so right away in dealing with Beacon Press. There was no commercial advantage on his part, so of course that would have been really bad. So he arranged that right away. That was that was called into question in the court case that he was involved in, because even that 5-3 made me think of it, 5-4 in favor in the Gravel senatorial immunity, and then you mentioned 6-3 in the case of the whether it's okay to go publish, prior restraint couldn't work. That the 5-4 case was one that involved some of the people that voted on the for side were liberals, but they felt that the court was not going far enough in giving freedom to Beacon Press to go ahead and publish, and that the senator was criticized for doing that with Beacon Press. The more personal odd thing, that one more twist to this saga, is that when the United States Justice Department investigated how did Beacon Press get the papers and what was the relationship and so on, they enlisted some, besides the FBI people, they enlisted some of the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, because Ellsberg had worked at Rand Corporation. Rand Corporation's contract was always with the Air Force. Who turns out to be one of the investigators? My brother.
Boy, the tangled web, your family.
My brother was a colonel in the Office of Special Investigation for the Air Force and is assigned to go up to Cambridge to work on this case. And so there was, for some time, very odd family conversations during that time. But that was a very strange twist.
Well, one of my marching orders is to end this on time. We have time for one more question. And an opportunity for Doug to make a closing remark. Let's go ahead and take this one more question.
My concern about this whole thing is that when the Ellsberg information came out, I felt that I thought it was almost a form of treason. It bothered me. I just gotten out of the service, and I thought, why are they releasing something that they were not supposed to release without going through proper channels? So we have the freedom of the press, which is probably the backbone of our nation, and then you've got information that's considered security, classified information for the security of the country. And when they intersect, going forward, how do you resolve a situation like this? Should there be something in place before anything is published that it's cleared, maybe a neutral body or something? It just bothers me to think that anybody can get their hands on something and publish it, and after it's published, the damage is done, regardless of how the court rules.
So the question is there any way to vet this stuff in advance so that irreparable harm is not made? And I'm going to be careful because I'm tiptoeing into legal stuff, but I think the Supreme Court decision was on the issue of prior restraint, and that they felt in this particular case, and there's a snippet in the film of the lawyers arguing, and what one of the lawyers that's representing the Times of the Post argues to the court is that there shouldn't be prior restraint because this is a historical document and therefore does not threaten any current operatives or that kind of thing, and that the court apparently accepted that. Now, the other thing to think about, and even though I think Doug and I are both strong supporters of what Ellsberg did to get to the point you're making, at the same time, we did not know it at the time, although we know it now, Henry Kissinger was engaged in secret negotiations with representatives of the North Vietnamese government in Paris. Had that become public and blown up in that summer of no progress was made in those negotiations at that time. In the summer of 1972, after the so-called Easter Offensive failed, is when those negotiations reached a point where the North Vietnamese gave up the demand that President Thu resign, and the Americans gave up the argument that the North Vietnamese had to pull their troops out. So the deal was sealed. Had those negotiations blown up and the deal not been sealed and that been leaked, one could legitimately argue whoever leaked that caused the war to go on longer and more people to die unnecessarily. So that's where it gets a little iffy, is the way I would look at it.
I think the intersect you're talking about is always there, and it's not resolvable except by good judgment by the players. I don't picture any institution that could kind of benignly mediate that sort of thing. I think the intersect is there. It's a tough call, and one has to just deal with it. I used to be asked once in a while, especially by Alaskans, did Gravel do this as a stunt? And I always, that's a worry, of course, with people that do something like this. But I always answered no. Those hours of talking it out with him and all, I was convinced that we didn't do it as a stunt. Now, even if he had, you're back to the old point in philosophy class, can an act be good unless it's intended to be good? So there still could be good even if it was a stunt. But it wasn't a stunt, I don't think, in Gravel's case. I just did want to say, stepping back from it, if I might,
Yes, absolutely.
that teaching in a college of public affairs and public policy, the thing that I think that part of the message of this little story that I tell is that if you're in a staff position in public service, it can come up without trying and by accident and by inadvertence that you're thrown into a brush with history. You didn't mean to be, but you are. And oftentimes that brush with history involves ethical dilemmas, almost always. And so it's accelerating and important. I think that staff persons, public students we teach here, they should be aware that you can be faced with very high stakes, high drama, and as I say, without trying to be too heavy about it, a brush with history.
Well said. I think that's an appropriate closing note. I'd like to thank all of you for participating there. We have wonderful questions from the audience. I hope you got a lot out of this. I also want to thank the John Glenn College for putting this on. We have a wonderful treasure in having done here on our faculty for someone who's touched history so closely and put himself on the line when he had to for what was the good of the country, I think, as it turned out. So Doug, thank you, and thank all of you.